Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today on our sixth and last webinar of this AMCL USA webinar series, Riding the Second Wave of Asset Management from Inventory to Strategy with Ruth Wallsgrove. My name is Kaylee Watson, and I'll be your moderator today. Due to the amount of attendees today, we will be answering key questions at the end of this presentation. Today, we are not enabling the hand-raising option. Instead, please type your questions in the question box at any point during the presentation. If we are unable to answer your questions due to time restraints, we will answer the rest by email after the presentation. I am also available to walk you through any technical difficulties through the chat box. Note that you can switch from computer audio to phone audio on the GoToWebinar panel if you're having any trouble with it. I will now hand it over to Ruth.
Thank you, Kaylee. So this is the last of our series of 6, and this is very much about looking forward, not just talking about where we are now with asset management, but also what might come next. So, I wanted to say, if you missed any of the previous webinars, they're actually all available through recordings. So just get in contact with us at that email address, and we can link you to the recordings. Okay, AMCL, we're a dedicated asset management consultancy. We don't do anything else. So that's what we do, and we work across the world. And experiences such as in this webinar are really pulled from working with all kinds of different organizations, actually across more sectors than here, across essentially, and that should say 6 continents, not countries. Okay, this is a range of the people we work with, both in North America and elsewhere. And my name is Ruth Wallsgrove. I'm the Director of Trainer and Principal Consultant for AMCL USA. Oops. I have built a team myself in what's now Sydney Trains, and I was involved in the first standard. But now I mostly work in North America with key organizations. Last year, I co-wrote a guide to building an asset management team with Lou Cripps of RTD, and I'm on the board of something called Talking Infrastructure, which is an Australian-led website, which we'll come back to. Okay, now this whole presentation was really inspired by a conversation I had with one of the thought leader teams in the USA, where they commented that if they had been further along the road of asset management than they are, and they're quite sophisticated already, they could have done even more to support their organization in assessing what they could cut and any implications of postponing work. As part of what they do is power, and there's a bit of loss of income for power companies with obviously industrial and commercial organizations not working. So I thought this was a very interesting comment, which is we could have done even more if we'd been a little bit further along. They did already support their organization in thinking about what they could postpone and therefore where they could save money. And then the next comment they said was, and that in thinking about this, they thought that if they had known where they wanted to get to in this phase, they could have got there faster. So this presentation is really to talk with, now I know you don't know what Wave 2 is yet, but we'll come on to that. It's also about thinking about now we know what we know about these phases of asset management and how to do them. How could this help us actually get through them faster? I don't mean get through them and stop them, but get through them onto the next bit, which I think is a really important concept. So what we're going to talk about is, first of all, is what is this concept of waves of asset management. We're then going to talk about riding Wave 2, what that looks like, what it involves, how to organize it, and then leading into then what might be an optimized roadmap, meaning if you already knew before you started where you wanted to get to and what it took, what would that roadmap for asset management look like? And I want to finish really looking at what might the next wave look like towards Wave 3. Now, I want at this stage just to, we haven't asked this question on previous webinars, and I'm intrigued. So I'm about to launch a poll, which is going to ask you, what's your primary professional identification? So I'm launching this. I'm not trying to do anything with the answer. I'm just curious as to we should have done this in the first webinar and see whether anybody changed their mind through this series of webinars. Okay, one more 30 seconds, then I'll close it. Okay, that's very interesting. I'm going to close it. So it looks as if it's saying that 52%, that means just over the majority of you on this perhaps advanced webinar, actually consider yourself an asset management practitioner. In other words, you see yourself as an asset management professional, whereas 48% have another primary profession. Now, there's not a right answer to this one, obviously, because asset management involves lots of different professionals, but that's very interesting. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so let's just start by talking about what we're talking about. What's a wave of asset management? I want to take us back to the invention, if you like, of asset management. Modern asset management was essentially created in the late 1980s in South Australia in response to state government question about infrastructure assets. What do we need to spend over the next 10 years to keep our levels of service to our customers the same? Now, I think that's a very fundamental question. We want to know, what do we have to do to keep delivering to the customers? What was startling was that nobody knew how to answer the question. And modern asset management comes out of, all right, how do we work out what we will need to spend over the next 10 years if we want to keep our levels of service up? In other words, they're not going to deteriorate. And the answer, in a nutshell, was something that we've called ever since an asset management plan, an integrated plan of everything we need to do for the assets. It was always assumed that it was at least 10 years, although lots of people don't do 10-year plans still. And it's based on the idea of asset life cycle costing, in other words, a whole life cost model. And it used even some fairly simple techniques like age profile, just to see how many assets we would expect in any year might need replacing. So it was fairly straightforward. Okay, so that was the invention of asset management. And it's worth pointing out that before this was invented or created or discovered, whichever word you want to use, there already had been some very interesting work in advanced maintenance management and in reliability engineering, and including two key concepts. One is degradation or deterioration modeling. In other words, understanding how different assets actually deteriorate over time, which turns out to be very fundamental to making optimal decisions. And the second thing, which is maybe more familiar to everybody, is that the idea of a computerized maintenance management system, work management system, now often called an EAMS, an enterprise asset management system, they were already being used, started to be used by the time asset management was invented. So they predate. Obviously, they feed into it, but they come from a slightly different set of questions. All right, so if that's what asset management was and what it was building on, what actually happened next historically? I think we've put a lot of thought about this and perhaps a little heartache, because a logical next step would be, well, I can't really plan 10 years for all of my assets if I don't know what assets I have, and if I don't know how old they are, where they are. And this was first of all, was applied to things like water assets, where in those prehistoric days, people actually didn't know where the pipes were. So a lot of water organizations and agencies, and not just water, had assets they didn't know they had, because without having gone to actually record it, you forget what you've got. And there's all sorts of funny stories about assets that people have lost, including assets that it's hard to imagine how anybody ever lost. So the thinking was, well, we can't do a good plan based on what assets we have and how old they are and how long we expect them to last if we don't know what we have. And that really took us right into what we now call Wave 1, which is asset inventory. So asset inventory it's a good name for it. I didn't invent the waves. In fact, the waves were invented by the person who invented asset management, Dr. Penny Burns. But the idea of Wave 1 is we go off and we collect our asset inventory data. What do we have? Where is it? when was it installed? Very basic data that we need to have if we're going to really do anything sophisticated with our assets. So it's a good name for it. Now, what happens in asset inventory, of course, is you spend time collecting your assets, and then you probably put them somewhere. And the most common place to put your asset inventory over time has been the work management system, the EAMS. Because the work management system needs an asset inventory, needs to know what assets we have to do the work on, most people use such a system, an EMS, to hold their asset inventory or register. So far so good. If you are getting sophisticated, you might then start looking at, in more detail at the question of what the status of your assets is, asset condition. And many organizations have spent actually quite a lot of time and money on asset condition. For example, machinery that can help you look at track or road asset condition. So there's a whole sort of technology. When I first got involved in asset management at the end of the 1990s, it was very fashionable to be looking at very sophisticated equipment that could help you collect asset condition data. Okay, so far so good. But the bad news is that 30 years on, if we say that the first people doing asset management were started in about 1990 in Australia and then New Zealand, 30 years on, when we look around the world, some sectors, some organizations, some countries haven't really gone beyond collecting their asset data. And what's the problem with that? Well, the asset data doesn't do anything for you. The asset data is useful, but until you use it to make better decisions, it's just sitting there, possibly in a very expensive EAMS. So wave one is asset inventory, and we might ask, what's kind of peak wave one? And I think I might put a hypothesis here that peak wave one is ISO 55000. Anybody who's not aware of ISO 55000, it's the international standard on asset management. And what it does basically is it specifies a good system framework for your asset management. It doesn't do it for you. It doesn't tell you how to do it. But what it's giving you is a checklist of things you ought to have in place in order to start making good asset decisions. So it's a framework on which you can build. But this, of course, isn't the end of the game. Here is a little journey, asset management journey, from innocent, don't have a clue, right through to being best in the world. This one actually comes from London Underground in Britain. And essentially, if you do all that work to get to ISO 55000 certification, you are competent. You're not brilliant, you're competent. You've got a framework on which you can build, but you still have the work to do to really start optimizing your decisions and delivering real benefits to your organization. So sometimes it can feel like we have to do quite a lot of work before we actually see any results. So that's peak wave one. However, if we bear in mind what asset management was meant to be about, remember that there had already been maintenance management and reliability engineering, and the concept of an integrated plan based on whole life cost models, we can ask the question, what happened to everything else? We've now got our EAMS, we're pretty good on asset condition, we know where our assets are, but where are those integrated, say, 10-year, longer-term asset management plans based on whole life cost models? What about the use of systematic failure codes? So we really can get a handle on how our assets, not only how they fail, but how that changes over time. In other words, degradation modeling and our degradation curves. What about optimized maintenance? Have we all made good use of optimized maintenance techniques, which were really in place almost before asset management was born? And above all, we go back to that question, what do I need to have to spend in order to provide a level of service? Are we all there? Do we understand that relationship? Now, I'm going to just suggest a second little poll, which is I'm just curious as to for these things, so asset inventory, for example, and then everything on this page, where is everybody? I'm going to be very interested in the answer. Which of these does your organization have in place? I'll give you a minute to have a look at. Do you feel you've got a good asset inventory? You've got an effective EAM system which actually does track failure well? Do you have a 10-year integrated plan? Integrated means everything, by the way, because if you don't have everything, if you've got more than one plan and not everything's in it, you'll miss things. What about whole life cost modeling? And what about how well we model this relationship between what we do to the assets and what we get out of them in performance for the customers? Okay, this is looking very interesting. Obviously, I could have been on a hiding to nothing with this question. If everybody said that they had everything, my hypothesis might be slightly less. I would be very happy to hear that everybody has everything. Okay, let's just have 30 seconds more to, and assume if you've no idea what the question means, that probably means you don't have it. So anyway, thank you. I'm going to close that now, and this is very interesting, because on this webinar, 61% say that you have got a good asset inventory, you know what assets you have, you've got data, not necessarily interesting data about them, about how much they cost, but you know what you've got and where it is and when it was installed. 14% have an effective EAMS with good failure codes, and the same number have a 10-year plan. Now, that's very good. A lot of people, encouraged by their regulators and funders, have much shorter term plans. So a 10-year plan is really best practice. 20% have whole life cost models, and that really warms my heart, because whole life cost models have a great cost benefit ratio. They are not hard to do, and they're incredibly useful. And then 11% feel you've got some way in modeling asset work performance. So that's very good. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so what we probably have is a lot of people who are in wave 2. So the key question remains, what do we have to spend to achieve our target performance now into the future? Only that's not, in fact, the end of the game, because the next question that comes to a lot of us in wave 2 is, why do we have the organizational targets we have in the first place? I'll come back to this issue because I think this may be a clue to where we need to go next. Okay, so riding asset management wave 2, lots of fun. Cue lots of pictures of surfers, of course. To me, there are some key elements of the way wave 2 is defined. Building on that asset inventory, you know what assets you've got. We're now starting to do something with that data. The first real ingredient in wave 2 is alignment. That we've really rethought how we do work on the assets to target it at our overall organizational objectives. If that sounds straightforward, it possibly means you haven't tried, but why it's not as straightforward as it sounds is because we tend not to make decisions explicitly taking our organizational objectives into account. For example, technical standards don't usually talk about what to do to meet a particular target because they're not asked to. So alignment is actually almost the biggest problem in wave 2. Secondly, fundamental to wave 2 is that we are thinking strategically. So Penny Burns, who invented asset management, she talks about this stage being strategic asset management because we're basing it on strategy, not necessarily business strategy, although that has to come into it, but systematic strategies for our assets, for our classes of assets, different types of assets, and our lines, our networks, our sites. We get systematic asset strategies is really just standing back and asking, how do we want to manage this particular group of assets going forward? And it's very, very key to good practice strategic asset management. And then the third element that I think is important is that the name of the game is optimization. We're starting to put into place, bit by bit until it all joins up, optimizing on risk, cost and performance, using such basic tools as corporate risk framework, whole life cost modeling, cost risk optimization and portfolio optimization. So I'm not going to say too much about each of those. I'm hoping that you recognize them, and if you don't, that you'll be intrigued by them anyway. So those things: aligned, strategic, and optimized. And what I wanted to do, rather than go into detail about how to do a risk framework or how to do whole life cost modeling, I want to talk about what it all adds up to when you do it. Because remember, this was kicked off with talking with an asset management team that I work with, where they said that if they knew what this was all going to add up to in terms of better decisions, not individual decisions, but better decisions corporately, they would have seen the point of the tools and understanding what they needed to do. So the hypothesis here is, if I give you some examples of what's possible through if you start putting all of these in place. And of course, I welcome any questions about this. Now, these are all real examples. Now, this is more a question than an answer. Talking to an asset manager, and again, in a big organization that's already done quite a lot of asset management, he commented that there were still people in top management who didn't really get the point. And for him, the point was that they have a sort of naive idea, kind of pre-asset management idea, if you like, that if you don't do anything to the assets, everything stays still. So if we don't have any money because we've got we haven't got so much income coming in because of COVID-19, we can kind of put everything on hold and nothing, and at the end of it we can pick it up again. And he said the problem is that they haven't kind of got built into them, these managers, that assets degrade or become obsolete. So even to stay where you are, not to improve anything, not meet any more customer demands or more customers, is going to take money and effort. And if you stop maintaining and renewing your assets, the performance of the assets will go down. Now, I'm hoping that that's absolutely obvious to everybody here. The interesting challenge in this is how to get it into the DNA of our organizations, that you have to do some things just to stay still. It's a great Alice Through the Looking Glass quote. It takes all the running you can do just to stay where you are. If you stop running, everything will start to degrade. And I wanted just to talk about, so what? If we understand how our assets deteriorate over time, that's the same thing as understanding the probability that an asset will fail over time, how that changes over time, and understanding it essentially from having good historical failure data. The only way that you can model deterioration is to have a lot of data points. They don't have to be all yours. You can do deterioration modeling by pooling data. But the key thing here is you have to have access to that historical failure data, which takes us back to the issue of whether everybody understood why failure codes in our work management or EAMS system was so critical. It's like some people were handed this thing in a box, which is called an EAMS, and it said that you had to do failure codes, but not everybody understood why. And that, of course, is going to give us problems. We're not collecting that data. So let's just have a look at this very quickly. This is a typical deterioration or degradation model. It's called a bathtub curve. Not all assets actually follow this curve, but quite a few mechanical ones do. Now, if we understand that because we've got a big enough data set of what's failed and why, how do we use that? Well, the obvious thing is that we need it for building our whole life cost models. Why do we need deterioration or degradation to build our whole life cost models? Because the work we do on the assets is to counteract degradation. If the assets didn't degrade, you wouldn't have to do any maintenance, you wouldn't have to do any renewals, replacements, or refurbishments. So that probability of failing over time also is going to drive us in what we want to do over time. This is an example of a mechanical asset where basically over time the chance of it failing are going to go up, and that means that things like reactive maintenance are going to have to go up. But also, of course, the consequential costs of failure. If the asset fails and impacts on customers, there's going to be bigger impacts, of course, the more often it fails. So all those costs are going to go up. All right, so that's a whole life cost model with risk in it. Did I say that whole life cost models really should have risk in them? Because that's often going to drive you to actually make decisions like when to do maintenance or replacement. What happens if you have a whole life cost model? I love whole life cost models, but so what? I've got a deterioration model, I've got a whole life cost model, so what? What am I going to do with it? And this, of course, takes us into the heartland of optimization. For example, the cost risk optimization curve, the classic Wave 2 asset management curve that shows that there's an optimal time to replace an asset. And if you leave it longer by some years, the risks and costs actually go up. Essentially, your total cost of ownership goes up fairly dramatically if you fail to replace your assets on time. When I'm teaching this, I often say, we kind of think, can we put off replacing? And this curve tells you, well, you can, but you're going to pay for it. If you put off replacing past a certain point, it's going to cost you year on year. So, taking us from failure codes, understanding degradation, whole life cost models, and cost optimization. So a lot of things follow from understanding that basic principle of the assets deteriorate. I'm sorry if this is kind of bleeding obvious. However, I did want to say just in passing and provocatively that asset condition really only helps if it helps you get at that underlying deterioration or degradation. It's not a thing in itself, it's a surrogate for understanding how things get worse over time. And it's related, how good an asset condition measure is directly related to how accurately it's capturing that underlying degradation. If it's not really connected to it, it's not going to help you very much. I'm just going to say that, leave that and move on. But it shows us that a naive attitude to asset condition, that it's great to measure anything that we call asset condition, won't really take you much forward in Wave 2. Okay, another example, this is a real example, is about risk appetite. If you've not come across the concept, it's very, very useful in its own right, because it's trying to, the basic principle is capturing what your top management, your executive team, actually think about risk. And that's very, very useful, not for some mechanical reason, but because it's telling you what they care about. If it's not absolutely clear what the priorities from the top are, risk appetite with top management, it's not your risk appetite that's the interesting question, it's theirs. What are they prepared to put up with and what are they not prepared to put up with is very, very useful in helping them and you clarify what is most important. And remember, the principle of alignment is understanding what top management thinks important, there, so we can manage the assets to meet it. Now, if we can move this a little bit further, which was Tacoma Power has done some very nice things here, we start to quantify it with some way of putting values on these risks, values as in dollars. We can start to ask, what would any given level of risk, acceptable risk, risk appetite, what would it mean in practice? And I think this is a very fundamental question for asset managers, which is, if this is the risk appetite top management and the board want, what's it going to cost? And the kind of questions this modeling starts to let us answer is, did you mean it? You said that you really didn't want this to happen, but when we look at how much that it costs us to get that level of risk management, is that really what you meant? In fact, would you be interested in looking at maybe if we had a little less risk, if our appetite was a little more bold, what might we save? Now, this is not trying to put ideas into the head. It's allowing top management to start to weigh up the costs and the risks in an adult way. And we can start to then use it to ask whether we really mean the current organizational targets. Not a lot of people have actually carried this through to say, if this is the level of risk we want, what does it mean in terms of what we do with the assets and what's that cost? And is that the right answer? But I think this is where Wave 2 is getting, so we can start to answer that question. And I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that. And then this is another real example. People have used this curve in some very interesting ways. If you plot how much risk you have against the kind of cost you bear in managing that risk, you always end up with the same shaped curve, where essentially the way to read this is that as an asset manager is, at this point, a little bit of expenditure on the x-axis will get you a lot of risk reduction. Whereas if you look here, it's going to take a lot of expenditure to get a very little risk reduction. And understanding that risk reduction per dollar is, I think, again, a good practice wave 2 concept that we want to be able to use. Now, why is that useful? Because it tells you that things you can do over here are going to get much more bang for your buck. Once you're over here, which probably means you're quite risk averse, you're going to spend a lot of money to get any further improvement. So, for example, if I gave you an extra $1, what's your confidence that that would change anything? Here, the confidence can't be very high. Here, you can be pretty sure that extra dollars could really help. So even without putting in some complex risk framework, we can start to visualize and model risk by starting to look at, you can do this with subject matter experts because they know, actually, if you ask them in the right way, they actually know whether they're confident an extra $1 would make any difference to performance or to, to failure. And then you can start to say, that means that we get more benefit from spending over here than here. So I think, again, that's a very fundamental wave 2 concept. Of course, this curve is quite interesting because there's a second thing going on, which is that through optimization, what does optimization really do? What optimization really does is that it allows you to move that curve, change the game. The more we optimize, the more we can move that curve so that essentially you're going to get more for less. So our job as asset managers is twofold. One is to understand that relationship between risk and cost, and then see what we can do to move the curve. Okay, so those are 3 real examples, and I hope they just give a flavor of what we can do when we can put it all together. Okay, I haven't quite finished on this though, because I talk a lot to executives, senior management teams, and I usually say, this is the deal. This is what asset management's about. If you're clear about what your priorities are, what your organizational goals are, asset management is the rest of us then making sure that everything we do with the assets is really targeted, will deliver your organizational goals. So that's the deal. You tell me what you want, and then our job is to organize to give it to you. Except I was giving this to an executive in a rail infrastructure company, and the commercial director turned to the operational director after I'd said, they all nodded, yeah, this is good news. But the commercial director then said, hang on, why did we pick the targets, the goals we had corporately in the first place? Why have we got 95% availability? Where did that come from? And all the directors scratched their head. And they went on, wouldn't it be great to know how much more would it cost us to get 96% availability? Or how much could we save if we only went for 94% availability? In other words, at the moment, our top management are making these targets without, in fact, all the information they need to make a really optimal corporate business decision. Again, not a lot of people have really gone there, but I hope you can see that that is the question they should be asking. So this is something we use when we're teaching, which is, okay, top management tell us what their goals and target and risk appetite is, and our job in the asset community is then to give them options and implications. Our job is not to make the big decisions about what capital we're going to spend. Our job is to inform the decisions of top management. And we don't say this is the only option, this is you've got to do it, that doesn't work anymore. We give them options, and we try to do it in a neutral voice, which says we're not promoting one particular one. This is what you get if you choose this one. This is what happens if you choose that one. And if we can give them that information, they can then make informed decisions, make decisions that then we go away and deliver. I think there are 2 things to be said on this. The first is that this is a really, for all of those of you who see yourself as asset management practitioners, I think a big part of your job is how do we make what we do know collectively and we can work out about the assets, how do we make that accessible to top management? Remember, they don't know what's happening with the assets if you can't tell them. And if you tell them in a 50-page report of small text with lots of tables, they're not much the wiser. So a big part of our job is to make it accessible to them when they're making decisions in the right form for them to use. But we can then go on and say that there's a second question, which is how do we support them in setting the targets in the first place? Okay, so that's more or less about what my vision of Wave 2, optimized Wave 2. And just very quickly, I wanted to go through the second question, which is, if we can see where we want to end up, what's an efficient way of putting those blocks in place? And for me, the elements are, first of all, making sure we've got an aligned system, which probably requires an asset management system, ISO 55000 compliant, which looks at how all the pieces fit together and how they're pulling in the same direction to meet our corporate objectives. We need strategies in order to build a plan. We do need a risk framework to allow us to compare different options when we prioritize what's in the plan. We need whole life cost models, just like Penny Burns said all those years ago. That's what we need as the basis for longer term planning. We need to do optimizations at several different levels, not just what projects, but how we put them together and whether we should have a capital project or whether in fact we should do something with maintenance, all these different levels of optimization. Of course, we have to have the asset information support the plan. The bad news is that it's probably more than even a decent enterprise asset management system gives you at the moment. And worst of all, of course, this means changing the way people think about asset decisions, changing processes, changing the whole culture of the organization to think integrated, optimized, risk-based longer term. So for me, taking all of that, the optimized asset management roadmap for Wave 2 is really, it does assume you have an asset inventory. The question of whether you could do it without an asset inventory is a kind of 3 glasses of wine question. But assuming you do know what assets you have and where they are, the real elements, I think, are these. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these in detail, but you might just notice that the first 3 all seem to be about people. And I thought one way of looking at this is to pick up a wonderful model for asset management. If you've not seen it, it's incredibly useful, but just kind of laying out, these are all the things you have to worry about. You're going to do good practice asset management. It's often called the 6-box model because it has roughly 6 blocks of things we have to get right. You'll notice all driven by your organizational strategic plan and goals. And you'll notice that there's delivery processes, which of course we need to have efficient. They usually are fairly efficient. There's strategy and planning and decision making, the heartland of asset management. There's having the right information, which is not just data, but also knowledge and experience. And unfortunately, it also involves people. I mean, not really unfortunately, but you know that anything that involves organizational structure and people's attitudes is probably going to be the most complicated bit to get right. And on the other side, we understand risk, and we also got a learning loop of plan, do, check, act. Okay, against this wonderful model, and if you haven't seen it, email me. I'd be happy to talk. I love talking about 6-box model. But what does it mean for the roadmap? So against these different blocks, what are we really going to have to concentrate on if we want to really pull through this more sophisticated, optimized, aligned strategic view? Well, basically, the first 3 are all in people. Then we need to really start thinking about our strategic framework and how we do the plan. So those are all key elements. We do have to get good risk understanding. Most people don't start with good risk understanding. It probably means something they need to be trained, not just told about. And then we need to get good practice decision-making processes in place, like whole life cost modeling, cost risk optimization, maintenance optimization, all those things. And we probably need to do some work on the information we didn't collect the first time around. We didn't quite know how we were going to use it. So that, to me, this is only just indicative to show you that I think the emphasis has to be on people. And then you have to kind of go back to people again. So for me, we need to make sure we understand what asset management, what strategic asset management is really about, know where you are now so you can prioritize where to go next, commitment and communication, then looking at your strategy and your objectives as asset managers, improvements to planning. Everybody has planning, so it's a matter of improving it. And that is one very good tool is asset class strategies, putting in place a risk framework, whole life cost modeling, a more strategic, I think it's not just a strategic approach to asset information, it's also more informed by what we're going to do with the information. And then just keep communicating, communication, communication, communication. And just to run through this in front of, so the first things on a good Wave 2 roadmap are really making sure you've got the training in place, people know what they're talking about, and communicating. And those two might be very well connected. A good way to communicate what asset management is to do some introductory training for a broad range of people. Lots of organizations have, not only London Underground we talked about earlier, but MTA in New York, for example, PG&E. They have a very broad introductory program to get lots of people through some basic asset management training. Okay, and then we need to know where we are, and we need to put into place what our strategies are, starting with what's our overall strategy towards asset management, which is called a SAMP, or Strategic Asset Management Plan. Then start looking at making real improvements to the way that we plan ahead, make it longer, include more assets, start to make it more data-driven, and then ultimately, it keeps going, properly risk-based, risk reduction per dollar, put in place those supporting asset class strategies, think about risk, think about cost. We can't optimize risk and cost if we don't understand them. So we need probably better data on both of those and the asset information strategy. Okay, so that is my very quick how to do second wave asset management. So the waves, just to recap, the waves of asset management so far, there's kind of pre-asset management, maintenance management, reliability, engineering, which not everybody has taken full advantage of still. So it's worth going back and picking up things we knew 30 years ago. If we haven't already exploited them, they're there to be used. Wave 1 is asset inventory, understanding what we have. Wave 2 is starting to use that understanding to really make optimized planning, essentially. Planning not just next week, but 10 years' time. What do we need to be doing to our assets to deliver our corporate objectives? And at the end of Wave 2 is that we now are fairly confident that we're optimizing asset decisions at all levels, now and into the future, and it all adds up. So, where are you on this? I'm not going to poll this one, but it's a good question to ask ourselves, where are we in this journey? This is all adapted from Penny Burns in Talking Infrastructure. She was there at the beginning. She really promoted strategic asset management at the end of the 90s, and she's now talking about where does this take us next? So towards Wave 3, some ideas. I want to just, I'm going to finish on this. I think an important thing is we need to start what I'd call scenario modeling or equivalent, because we want to plan for the future, 10 years at least into the future. And we can't just assume the world is fixed for the next 10 years. We start to have looking, if this happened, if COVID-19 hit us, what would we do? What will happen when we recover from COVID-19? These different scenarios and appropriate asset plans for them. I think asset managers should be much more involved in new assets, like growth assets. We waste a lot of money on expensive new infrastructure that really doesn't ever do what it says it's going to. I'm not even talking about it overrunning in cost, never actually delivers. So I think we need asset managers asking harder questions, challenge, critiquing, and learning lessons from what have happened with projects behind. So asset management is not just the territory of maintenance and replacement. It's also what we're thinking of building for the future. Smarter key performance indicators in the top, starting to ask, what is this target going to cost us and what's going to, etc. Of course, it then has to be cascaded down to what we need for each individual asset or system to deliver. And this is a good slogan that a lot of us picking up. This comes from Lou Cripps, who I wrote Building an Asset Management team with. We need to look up and out instead of in and down. Asset management is not primarily a technical discipline. It's a business discipline, which is what do we need to do to our assets to deliver what our organization should be delivering. And that, of course, takes us to the question of why does our organization even exist? What's its purpose? What infrastructure does our society really require? And that is something that Penny Burns is exploring in this thing called Talking Infrastructure. And if you think that's above your pay grade, well, I think this is a good dialogue for us to be having. Why is it so important that asset managers are involved in the purpose of our organizations and what this is giving our communities and our societies and infrastructure? What we have to bring is the idea that we are looking after the assets for the longer term, not short-term decisions, that we are in the middle to understand both the assets and the business and to bring that together through analysis and modeling. This is another thing we've been talking about, is that we have to be grounded in reality. You can't have any old future. You have to start with where you are now, and you have to have that historical data and understanding to bring forward in order to predict what's going to happen. If people are just thinking, I would like this, and they are just pie in the sky world, and that's where we end up with some very, very expensive infrastructure mistakes. And above all, our job is how to make a future vision work in practice, because we're, if you like, the practical side of this, but we want to fuse it with where do we need to be going in the 21st century, which is going to give us increasing challenges on infrastructure. Okay, that is it. Further resources. I do encourage you to look at Talking Infrastructure. It's very easy. It's just talkinginfrastructure.com. And okay, I have to promote building an asset management team. We also, if anybody's interested, we're offering a free online 10-minute survey to assess the maturity of your organization, which if you've not done this, it's a very useful step. Remember, I was saying one of the first steps in Wave 2 is you have to know where you are to understand what you've got to prioritize going forward, what's missing. Okay, so I think it's now time to go to your questions. Any questions?
Yes, we've got a few here, Ruth. The first one, Doug asks, at what asset level are whole life cost models applied?
Yes, that's a great question. I'm glad to say that there have been people, not a lot of people have whole life cost models really in place, but those organizations who've done it very thoroughly really proved that the asset class, the type of asset, is really the right place to start with whole life cost models. I once did with colleagues in a previous company, tried to look at building a whole life cost model for an entire water system. And we realized it would take more than the rest of our lives to actually understand even the question. So good practice and experience, I've built whole life cost models, is do them at the level of the asset classes, whether that's build it at the level of a bus or a transformer class, and not an individual, but what does it look like for buses in general? What's it look like for water pumps in general, which would be different than what it looks like for wastewater pumps. And distribution transformers probably won't look the same as transmission transformers. But I really believe from experience that it's quite easy to do whole life cost models at the level of an asset class. And then, of course, you can build it up to look at what that looks like for a whole system or your whole portfolio. You don't want to get too detailed too early and start building individual whole life cost models for individual assets, unless they're big complex assets like maybe a generating plant. But to me, it's always going to be better to base it at asset class. You know what, and they're not difficult to do at asset class because some people will already know the answer. Your job as an asset manager will be to pull it all together. So a great question.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Lou. He asks, how do you see the collaboration between AM and other departments helping agencies post-COVID?
I think this is, of course, is almost the kind of question that got me going on this, which is that if we've got some Wave 2 asset management in place, like a fairly good handle on why we're doing the replacement assets we've got in the plan, that, of course, helps us immediately think, what could we defer if we don't have the money, for example, because we haven't got any passengers, and so we're not getting the income, or we don't have customers, the customer base has gone down. So for dealing with right now, I think that planning is very, very important. But I think what we can bring to it going forward for recovery is that I think it really comes down to the scenarios. We have to be supporting if this is what's happening, what's an appropriate level to spend on our assets. Remember, if we don't spend on the assets at all, they'll just deteriorate and you're giving yourself a big headache. So one question for me is, how can we let things like backlog build up? Picking on things which will give us kind of least risk and that we can recover fastest. Whereas there may be other things that if we don't do them, we'll be in trouble straight away. So I think it's that modeling to help this. I hope that makes sense. The scenarios. So to me, it's that moving towards thinking that we are able to look at the implications of scenarios. More or less customers, more or less income, putting things off as opposed to bringing them forward, and we can answer that. Now, why is that a collaboration with other departments? Because obviously we have to work with the people who are starting to model what will happen to passengers or customer numbers or electricity demand or whatever it might be, and the people trying to look at business planning. And of course, also in close communication with the people on the ground who always are the guys who know what's really happening with the assets. So that vision of, I mean, I have a grand vision, whether I'm articulating it perfectly at this point. I think it's that scenario ability to think about, if this happens, what can we do about it? If something else happens, you'll see it ties back to the idea that that's what we need to be feeding top management. That if this is what you want, this is what you need. If that's not what you want, then this is a different scenario. So it's very much that structured. I mean, a lot of us kind of do, it's quite hard work even to do an asset plan for what we assume, but we've got to get the ability to be nimble enough to start going, if something changes, this is how the plan should change as well. I hope that makes sense.
Definitely. So Gabrielle also asks, we are reasonably good at doing inspections on schedule and keeping condition information up to date, but how do we convert that information into economic terms? Our executives listen to us when we speak in the language of money, but we haven't figured out how to translate what we know into dollars.
Oh, wow, that's a good question. Yes. Now, I think the answer is, I can't give you a 10-second answer on that one, but you've absolutely nailed that that's the question. So we know we are on top of doing planned maintenance and inspections, so we kind of know what's happening with our assets. And we have to then say, what does that mean for the overall organization? And I think that's really a good way of putting the challenge from peak wave one, which is I know where my assets are. You know, I know what we need to do in planned maintenance, and people are doing the planned maintenance on time, and we've got good condition assessments. Remember that not all condition assessments are equal. Some condition assessments are more useful than others, but you've got that in place. It's like you've now got the data to start implementing decision techniques. Now, I'm not saying that your top management will go, oh, whoopee, you're going to do whole life cost models. But then the step we need to go is taking this data and some of the techniques we've got around, we don't have to reinvent. How do we start making it obvious what's important and what's not important on the basis of something like risk? How do we make it clear where we could or couldn't save money, where we need to spend more money? How do we start doing that? That is that kind of modeling piece in the middle. And I think, honestly, you've got some building blocks to put in place, but none of them are that hard, but you have to do them. You can't jump straight from the data to the economics. You've got to, in the middle, it's what we spend on the assets against what we get from the assets that is fundamental to wave two. I call it modeling, but don't let that frighten you. It's not. It could be fairly simple things using spreadsheets, but it is modeling because it's like, what's the relationship of the inputs to the outputs? And therefore, Gabrielle, that's where I'd say I'd go next. Thankfully, there are lots of people, some of them on this call, no doubt, who actually have done quite a lot of nice things that they're very happy to share. If you're not so familiar with that, we can easily put you in touch with some very nice practice around the US, where people are really starting to do this modeling and analysis. There isn't an easy answer, so that was a hard question, but really to the point, that is exactly what Wave 2 is about. So thank you for that.
Great. Our next question comes, great. I think we've still got a little time for either one or two more. The next question here is from Samantha. She asks, we're probably still gathering the information we need to be at Wave 1. Any advice for us as we try to build support for just the basics to get us fully into Wave 1?
Yeah, now this is a great conversation that asset management practitioners have when they sit around a table at a conference, etc. Is there an easier way to do Wave 1? And one hypothesis is that it's easier to do Wave 1 if you see what the benefits of doing Wave 2 are. In other words, if you see how that data is going to be used, in the end, to make a huge difference to your organizations. I can't overemphasize that if our top management really understood the relationship between what they spend and what they get, they could make better decisions. We could all make better decisions, and they're bound to be happy. Nobody ever says, I don't wish to understand that anymore. If we understood that that's the benefit we're building towards, would that help us focus what we do in Wave 1? And I think the answer is probably yes. I was involved with asset information for a long time. I went through the same phase. I went through Wave 1. So for many years, I was talking about basic asset data and enterprise asset management. We didn't call them that, we called them work management systems. But you know, and I was fascinated, and I sort of thought that was what asset management was. But I think with the understanding of where we're going to go with the data, we can really target what's the most important data to collect in the first place. I once upon a time did a benchmark for London Underground with some very big other UK infrastructure, nuclear, electricity, water, and including some dialogue with the regulators, to look at people's asset information. And it was really striking. I mean, it still surprises me to this day, even though I kind of know it, that the people who had the most targeted, strategic, they knew why they needed the data and what was most important, and they went and they spent enough money to collect it, actually ended up spending less money on information than the people who were much more scattergun and had less strategic, and they just collected it because it was there, or because the IT salesman said they should have it, or they'd always collected it. We sort of assumed that the better the information you had, the more money you had to spend on it. And it turned out that was exactly the opposite way around. If you really knew why you needed what you needed, because you knew what you were going to use it for, you could actually do it much cheaper and much faster and much more efficient. It does need investment up front. It can't be done. It can't be done in a slapdash way. But so that the hypothesis is, if you know where you're going to use the data, that will make your strategy and your prioritization in Wave 1 much more efficient. I mean, obviously happy to talk about that more offline, but that is the current hypothesis we have here, is that it actually really helps you to know where it's all going. Because I didn't finish the sentence really, because if you don't know, you'll collect a lot of data that you don't need, and you won't collect the data you do need, which is the worst possible of all worlds. And the real telling bit is that asset information is extremely expensive, and therefore it really pays to know why you want the information you have. I think there's no question about it. You need the asset inventory, and it might be expensive and painful. And then that comes on to learning lessons from other people. There are people in the world who've got very good asset inventories. And as one of them said to me once, one of these organizations said, there is only one really right way to do it. In other words, that there's lots of ways to do it badly, but there's some principles about doing it well that will make it, that investment you put in it means that it's not only good data, but it'll stay good data. So I think there are some lessons there, and of course we'd be happy to talk about that. Another really good question.
Wonderful, thank you. I think that's it for now, since we're nearing the end, but we can answer all other questions through email after the presentation is done. Thank you, Ruth, and thank you everyone for joining us today in our final webinar, and have a great long weekend.
Thank you.